Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Tel Aviv University. My name is Maria Lul, and I'm an Irwin Cotler Fellow for the 2025-2026 cohort. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first event of the Diplomats Club for this academic year. The Diplomats Club is an initiative of the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Justice, and Human Rights at Tel Aviv University. The Institute, named after the renowned Canadian human rights advocate and former Minister of Justice, is dedicated to advancing democracy, human rights, and justice through research, education, and public engagement. Before we begin our program, I would like to extend a special welcome to the distinguished representatives of the diplomatic community, those already with us and those who will be joining us shortly. We are honored to have with us His Excellency Ambassador Stefan Ties from Belgium, His Excellency Ambassador Audrius Bruzga from Lithuania, His Excellency Ambassador Shen Tzatziki from North Macedonia, and His Excellency Ambassador Ezra Cohen from Panama. We also welcome diplomatic representatives from the embassies and delegations of Brazil, China, Cyprus, Egypt, the European Union, Greece, India, Italy, Kenya, Nigeria, Moldova, Portugal, Spain, Switzerland, Ukraine, the United States of America, Uzbekistan, and Zambia. Now to the topic at hand. Where is Syria headed? Today marks a significant milestone, the publication of the Arabic translation of Dr. Carl Yonker's book, The Rise and Fall of Greater Syria, A Political History of the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. This translation makes crucial historical scholarship possible and accessible to Arabic-speaking audiences at a pivotal moment in Syria's history. Our first session examines Syria after the revolution. We'll hear three perspectives on Syria's current situation and future prospects. Let me begin by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Carl Yonker, whose book we celebrate today. Dr. Yonker is the academic director of the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Justice, and Human Rights here at Tel Aviv University. He specializes in the contemporary history and modern politics of Syria and Lebanon. Dr. Yonker will speak on the battle for Syria in historical perspectives. Dr. Yonker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for showing up this morning. Very excited for you all to be here and to share a little bit about what's going on in Syria today. For those of you who aren't aware or following, last week marked the year anniversary of the fall of the Assad regime that brought to an end over 5 decades of Ba'athist Assadist rule and 6 decades of Ba'athist rule in Syria. So to say that this was a marked change, a revolutionary change, would be an understatement. Something profound has happened in Syria in the last year, despite the fact that there was about 13 years of civil war. Today I want to give you a little bit of historical background and also an understanding of the present when it comes to the struggle for Syria. The struggle for Syria was a phrase coined, it's the title of a book by the British journalist Patrick Seal. He wrote a book that was published in the 1960s, mid-1960s, that looked at basically the first 13 years of the Syrian state. 1 year before independence, from 1945, Syria gained independence in 1946, up until 1958, when Syria joined together with Egypt in the United Arab Republic. And what Seal writes about in this book is he presents a main argument, and that's an argument that Syria is fundamentally a weak state that is fragmented internally between different groups, religious, ethnic, and whatnot, and that the central state, whether it's in Damascus or in Aleppo or wherever, is fragmented and weak. It's not strong enough and capable enough to keep this diverse set of ethnicities and religions together. But because it's a weak state, it serves as a center for regional and international actors to try to expand their influence, and it's a site of great of hegemonic contest within the country. Seal's term essentially applies now, today. After December of 2024, Syria has returned to this state. The Assad regime, which we'll get into here in a moment, managed to establish a strong authoritarian state, centralized state that managed to put a lid, so to speak, through an Alawite-dominated regime on the different subgroups and ruled Syria with an iron fist, which many of you, if you can read on your own, some of the horrors of the Assad regime and what it perpetrated over 5 decades of rule on its own people, let alone over the last few years during the civil war. So, this is a map of Syria here on the right. And you can see that Syria sits at a geostrategic crossroads that links Anatolia in the north, where Turkey, the Anatolian Peninsula, with Mesopotamia, Iraq, the Levant, and the Mediterranean. Historically, this was a corridor for armies, for trade, and for ideology. Moving all through it, Syria was a passageway, a stoppage way. Following the First World War, you have the establishment of the French Mandate. 3 years after the First World War, you have the establishment of the French Mandate. And Syria is partitioned, essentially, geographic Syria is partitioned into statelets, smaller statelets. You have the state of Aleppo in the north, the state of Damascus in the center. You have Jabal Druze in the south. You have what's created out of it, which is Greater Lebanon, or Lebanon. And then you have the Alawite state along the coastal region. Within this first period of mandate rule, you have limited constitutional freedoms. The French ruled Syria. There was nascent, I guess, democratic life, but the Syrian state was ruled by the French. And this lasted up until the end of the Second World War, 1946, which delivered sovereignty, Syrian sovereignty, but not necessarily stability. And this is what Steele writes about in his book. In 1949 alone, within the course of 3 months, there were 3 military coups. All switched out. Generals fighting for power, generals fighting for influence and prestige, and within 3 months, there were 3 coups. In the early 1950s, it was ruled by another military leader, Adib Shishakli, that tried to stabilize the Syrian state. But you have fundamentally a weak state at the center. And in the 1950s, 1960s, you see not interference, but attempts at influence within Syria. You see the Soviet efforts to influence events in Syria. You see American efforts to influence events in Syria, whether that's through political machinations or influence and whatnot. You also see in the 1950s the rise of Arab nationalism with the rise of Nasser in Egypt. And Nasser forges an alliance with the Ba'ath Party, with Arab nationalists in Syria, and you have the creation of the United Arab Republic in 1958. That UAR alliance formally ends in the early 1960s. And in 1963, you have the rise of the secular Arab nationalist Ba'ath Party, led by Salah Jadid, that ends a fragile parliamentary era, an era of Egyptian influence. And he inaugurates a one-party security-heavy state that he rules for about 6 or 7 years. And then you have the rise of the Assad family. Hafez al-Assad, a military officer, launches his own coup, which is termed the corrective movement in 1970. And Assad begins building his regime. He begins by trying to establish a strong central Syrian state. He ousts his predecessors, and brings his sect, the Alawite sect, into power through the officer corps and through business and economics. He sets his sect, the Alawites, at the head of the Syrian state. The majority Sunnis are those who agree to work with the state are obviously brought in with the regime and work with the regime, but others are left out. And this is the dynamic within Syria. What we know about Syria for 50 years, and Ba'athist Syria, much like Ba'athist Iraq, was a combination of state capitalism or state-run economy, a pervasive and brutal surveillance state, that sought to project power of its own, mostly into Lebanon during the Lebanese Civil War, and also was dedicated to confronting Israel. Now, one of the ironies is that the Syrian regime has always been one of the more vocal critics of Israel, one of the more belligerent frontline states, so to speak, against Israel. But in those years of the Assad regime, the Syrian border and the Israeli border was one of the quietest borders in the region. So there was a disconnect between the rhetoric and the posture of the regime and the reality. The reality is that despite all the proclamations of wanting the Golan back, of being aggressive in terms of its approach to Israel, behind the scenes, the border was quiet. And in the 1990s, you saw actual negotiations between the Syrian and the Israelis, which will be talked about later. So this sets the stage for our current discussion. And what we saw with the Syrian uprising that began in 2011 was the beginning of a hope for change in Syria, a hope for a different Syria that was a different Syria without the Assad family, without Alawite dominance over Syria, for a democratic Syria. A new Syria. But what happened was the complete opposite. The harsh crackdown by the Syrian regime sparked a wider civil war, which raged for about 13 years. Hundreds of thousands were killed. Hundreds of thousands were displaced and are made refugees. It became one of the worst humanitarian crises the world has seen and witnessed and watched for 13 years, essentially. Before, in December 2024, when the Assad regime fell in basically a lightning, very quick offensive, the Assad regime was being rehabilitated, both within the region and already internationally by different regimes. The Saudis were coming back, the Emiratis were coming back. All these Arab regimes that had been against the Assad regime and against Syria were making their way back and trying to make peace, so to speak, with the Assad regime. The United States and other countries were also, in the European Union, were also trying to renegotiate this relationship, because after 13 years and basically a deadlock, they needed to come to a different understanding. But in December 2024, this changed when this lightning offensive captured Damascus. Assad fled to Russia, where he's still there in exile. And Ahmed Ashara, who we'll hear about in more detail coming up, has emerged as the leader of Syria, a transitional leader, but right now he's very much the one in charge, and it doesn't look so transitional. So this is the Syria of today. And what I want to focus on now is understanding some of the main regional and international actors and their interests in Syria and their actions in Syria, specifically in the last year, so that we can understand what this new renewed struggle for Syria looks like. The first country is Turkey. Turkey has gone from being one of the primary regional adversaries of the Assad regime to now the main patron of the new Syrian regime. It is Ahmed Ashara and the Syrian regime's most important backer today. It is responsible now for training the Syrian army. It supplies arms to the Syrian army. It is also trying to establish bases, intelligence bases in Syria. It is trying to cement itself or reemerge as an agent of influence within Syria itself. You have right now coordinated not operations, but coordinated efforts in the north of Syria in particular, with the Turkish army and the Syrian National Army that are trying to dominate a band of territory in the north that's traditionally been controlled by the Kurds. And this enables them to control key trade routes in and out of the country and key border crossings. Now, one of Ankara and Turkey's primary objectives in the north of Syria is to dismantle Kurdish autonomy and dismantle Kurdish control of the north. This is represented or seen in attempts to dismantle the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which was a Syrian or Syrian Kurdish military formation that's been supported by the United States and been very instrumental in holding Kurdish territory in the north part of the country. You also have the YPG, another Kurdish militia that, and you also have historically the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, which is the arch nemesis of the Turks. And so their efforts, the Turks' efforts right now are centered on trying to integrate the SDF within the larger Syrian army, also to dismantle the PKK and the YPG, and essentially neutralize their influence, Kurdish influence within the Syrian state by having it be brought into the larger Syrian army, the larger Syrian body politic. What Turkey does not want is an autonomous Kurdish area in the north of Syria. Just like in Iraq, they don't want the same thing to happen. They don't want a Kurdistan region on their border in northern Syria. So they will work very hard to integrate the Kurds into the Syrian state and try to blunt that from happening. Now, outside looking in, Turkey presents itself as a bridge between Damascus and Western states and also Gulf capitals. Turkey has a unique position of being a member of NATO, being connected to Europe, and seeks to play this role of bridging this gap between Damascus and the wider Western world. It also seeks to play this role within the Gulf, but that is much more difficult because the Gulf countries, especially Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Qatar, have their own interests at play in Syria itself. But at the end of the day, like I said before, it aims to minimize Kurdish influence. The next major country, regional country, is Israel here. After Assad's collapse, we saw Israel move forces into parts of Quneitra, right along in the Syrian, in the Golan Heights area, and to create a buffer zone based on the necessity of preventing jihadists from coming across the border and to establish themselves there on the southern border, but also to prevent the reestablishment of Iranian proxies, say Hezbollah and other Iranian groups along that border. Another justification that came as the Shara regime basically had some violent outbursts against several minorities, the Alawites on the coast and also the Druze in the south. Israel came in forcefully to say we're going to stand next with the Druze and we're going to protect them and to stay away. Since late 2004, since 2024, sorry, Israel has waged an intense air campaign across Syria, trying to destroy much of Syria's air defense network, its weapons depots, and Iranian-linked assets to prevent Syria from posing an immediate military threat to Israel. Its strategic aims are to demilitarize the southern part of Syria and to block, like I said, any revival of Iranian or Hezbollah corridors into the Golan and any kind of security risks that the Islamist government in Damascus might pose. Even in recent days, we've seen potential clashes with the IDF and Syrian forces in southern Syria at checkpoints. The Syrian army had a military parade to mark the one-year anniversary of the fall of the Assad regime, and we're making, very clear chants against Israel, against the Jews, and saying we're marching towards you. But at the same time, there's been negotiations that have been ongoing, brokered by the United States between Israel and between Syria in an effort to negotiate an Israeli pullback, a recognition or normalization. But these negotiations haven't really gone anywhere. Even though there's been a lot of fanfare, a lot of coverage, they still haven't progressed where I think Israel or the Syrian regime would like them to be. The Gulf states, which I'll focus on Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, their main area of influence is in financial power and in the area of reconstruction. They are aiming to re-enter Syria financially, whether that's in support of economic projects, rebuilding projects, banking, telecoms, things like that. And they're interested in signing large-scale agreements for ports, for energy, for infrastructure, and to rebuild institutions within the state, within the Syrian state. So far, none of these pledges that I've seen have been tied to any sort of specific reforms or anything like that, but they're seeking a return to their previous influence, to economic influence, and seeking returns. One of the main agendas behind this is not only for their own personal gain as states, but also to check Turkish influence and to check any sort of resurgent Iranian influence that might try to build within Syria itself. The third thing that they're trying to accomplish is to show their own leadership, that they're demonstrating their regional leadership and their own power. The GCC states in particular working as a bloc and demonstrating their united front. But at the same time, reconstruction money risks consolidating a new class of politically connected businessmen and ex-warlords. It risks creating a new class of leaders that might be just as corrupt as the previous generation. So it's not necessarily a guarantee for stability or progress. I'll talk briefly about Russia because we have a talk on Russia here coming up. Russia went from a protector of the regime, an ally of the Assad regime, to basically renegotiating its status in Syria. It was, together with the Iranians, was one of the Assad regime's main protectors during the civil war. It's granted him asylum and has refused so far to extradite him despite international arrest warrants. What Moscow is most interested in at this point is maintaining access to its to the coastal areas where it has an air base, where there's ports, and other facilities that are important to it for its ability to project power into the Eastern Mediterranean. It's the same logic that applied beforehand, and they're seeking to maintain it and renegotiate that. But doing so faces challenges. Shara himself is open to Russian overtures. He's open to negotiating, but there needs to be an arrangement made, and so far that hasn't happened. And we have to remember that this is also coming at a time that Russia is still bogged down in Ukraine, and these limit its abilities to fund, to invest in Syria itself, and develop itself there. The European Union has sought to build a relationship anew. And the first thing that happened was to remove sanctions and lift most of these economic sanctions, especially on security bodies and other entities within Syria. And they're trying to promote democratic renewal within the country and the foundation of pluralistic institutions and a new democratic Syria. The EU does not have military leverage, doesn't have security leverage. Its leverage is in producing or developing democratic institutions, economic institutions, and developing economic relations between Syria and the EU. Normalization has been rapid, but it's happened despite calls for more accountability. It also wants to negotiate issues of refugees and refugees returning to Syria, but will want more stabilization within the country itself. So to conclude and wrap up a bit, what we see are interlocking external agendas. You see that Turkey seeks to secure borders and influence over the new army and northern economy. Israel seeks demilitarization in the south and freedom of action. Gulf states aim to lock in a Sunni-led and Iran-distant Syria through reconstruction finance and debt relief. Russia wants to preserve its military footholds and try to avoid marginalization. All of these agendas overlap. Some collide with each other, some are complementary. But in general, everyone has their own interests and is trying to pursue their own interests within the country. So within Syria, you have other fault lines. You have the domestic fault lines, you have the external fault lines. And we see that essentially the struggle for Syria is still continuing today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Yonker, for that insightful historical analysis. Your work is providing essential context for understanding Syria's current challenges. We move on now to our next speaker, Mr. Roy Nahmias, the former Arab Affairs correspondent for Ynet. Mr. Nahmias brings extensive journalistic experience covering Middle Eastern affairs and will offer his analysis of the new Syrian constitution. He's also currently a PhD student of Professor Uriah Shavit here at Tel Aviv University. Mr. Nahmias, please proceed.
Thank you. Good morning. As Carl just mentioned, as you all may know, about a year ago, the rebels in Syria, headed by the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the HTS, decided to make their move. It was just a day after the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah just took place. And they decided to have their quick strike from the pocket of Idlib right to Damascus. And within about 10 days, they reached Damascus. They reached the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. The leader of the HTS, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, reached to the Umayyad Mosque of Damascus and declared his victory upon Bashar Assad. That was the moment of the end of the chapter of the civil war as we knew it, of that chapter. However, that was a beginning of a different chapter, a chapter of a campaign, a personal campaign of al-Julani about his image, about his legitimacy. And that campaign raised many questions so far about whether he left some of his belief, whether he has changed, whether he is a different person right now. I would say that not necessarily. And why? Let's try to understand it together. So, as I mentioned, on December 8th, Abu Muhammad al-Julani just reached the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, held his speech, and that was the beginning of the process of his renaming and rebranding of his campaign over his image. He renamed himself, he left his jihadi nickname, Abu Muhammad al-Julani, and returned to his original name, Ahmed al-Shara, and he changed his look from military uniform to suit and tie, but that was not the only case, because since then he adopted or took some other measures. He adopted softened rhetorics. He cherished his victory to all Syrians, meaning including the minorities, the sects in Syria. He held a national dialogue conference on February 25, just to show a sectarian reconciliation with the Kurds, with the Alawites, and so on. He also adopted a policy of inclusion vis-a-vis the women. For example, he appointed 2 women to key positions in his regime, and also he held talks with the Kurds in order to, in his attempt to reunify Syria, new Syria. And also he outreached the international arena. He had some high-profile meetings with President of Turkey, Erdogan, with Saudi Crown Prince, with the Emir of Qatar, and eventually with the American President Trump. Just lately, he had his historic visit in Washington. And moreover, his regime admitted publicly of having direct talks with Israel, in which he made some important gestures. He returned the body of Tzvi Feldman. He passed documents regarding Eli Cohen, and so on. So, was he unique in this behavior? if we are taking a look in about the past 2 decades, not necessarily. And why? There are other Islamist leaders that did the same. It was Erdogan, just after he was elected as the new prime minister of Turkey, 2002, just broke the Ramadan fast in his first visit to Italy, doing a meeting with Berlusconi, in order to ease the tensions that he is not going to Islamize Turkey. It was Khaled Mash'al, right upon the victory of Hamas in Palestinian elections, 2006, just a few months later, he declared that Israel is an existing fact. It was Rashid al-Anushi, the head of the Islamist opposition movement back then, that right upon his arrival to Tunisia at the beginning of the Arab Spring 2011, declared, "Don't you worry, I'm not a bin Laden or Khomeini, I'm closer to Erdogan." And it was also Mohammed Morsi that, after he was elected as the Egyptian president, declared that Egypt will not resort to a policy of aggression against Israel. So adopting softer rhetorics, it's quite widespread. So how can we analyze Ashara right now? I would suggest to analyze him by 2 main steps. First and foremost, his interim constitutional declaration, and the second, his Supreme Council of Fatwa, new Supreme Council of Fatwa. Regarding the interim constitutional declaration, a few weeks later, in the beginning of March 2nd, he appointed a committee of 7 members, and he asked them to finalize a new constitution, new interim constitution for New Syria, and they did it within 12 days on March 13th. This constitution was adopted and published. This is his signature, by the way. And we just have to understand, before we are reading extensively the text, to understand the context of this text, to understand the context of the body which is behind the Supreme Council of Fatwa, in Arabic, Majlis al-Ifta al-Ala. This Supreme Council of Fatwa, he appointed the new Supreme Council of Fatwa at the end, the 28th of March, just 2 weeks later, adopting this declaration. And under the leadership of the head of the new Supreme Council of Fatwa, Osama Rifai, which is related to the Muslim Brotherhood, we can find 2 interesting figures. The first, Abdelrahim Atwan. Abdelrahim Atwan was the Grand Mufti of HTS, of Hayat Tahrir Sham. He was the person that gave the approval to do this execution. For example, he used to talk against the democracy, the rights for women, and so on, about the importance of implementing the Sharia. And the other figure is Mazhar al-Wais, who was also a member of the Supreme Council of Fatwa of HTS, Hayat Tahrir Sham. And by the way, those 2 figures were appointed later on to another positions in the Syrian regime. Abdelrahim Atwan was appointed a few weeks later to a special advisor to Ashara for religious affairs, and Mazhar al-Wais was appointed as a new Minister of Justice. So in this context, they are very important in the cases of religious and law affairs. So let's take a look about the interim constitution itself. I think that the most important thing, the core of this text, is Article 3.1, which declares that the religion of the President of the Republic is Islam, and Islamic jurisprudence is the principal source of legislation. Again, Islamic jurisprudence is the principal source of legislation. In Arabic, الفقه الإسلامي هو المصدر الرئيسي للتشريع. Fiqh, it means that you need a faqih, a jurist, an Islamic jurist, in order to approve any law in New Syria. And who would be this Islamic jurist? This body, the new Supreme Council of Fatwa with Abdulrahim Atwan and Mazhar al-Wais, and this is the hint of the spirit of the new Supreme Council of Fatwa. So you need their approval of any law in Syria. But besides that, we can find very interesting potential tools in the text. As Dr. Yonker mentioned, the case of the minorities, for example, external threats, internal threats. He has very powerful tools in this text. Let's take, for example, Article 3.2 regarding the minorities. Freedom of belief is protected. The state respects all divine religions, and in accordance, and just the end, in accordance with the law. Which law? The law that compatible with Islam under the approval of the Supreme Council of Fatwa. But regarding the divine religions, are the Alawites and the Druze considered as divine religions? I'm not sure that under the Supreme Council of Fatwa and under the classical jurisprudence, they considered as divine, because it's only the Judaism, Christianity, and Islam considered as divine religions, and they might consider it as Hawarij, as sects that left Islam, infidels. So he has the potential to resume tension if needed in the future against those minorities. Regarding the Kurds, he has Article number 4. Arabic is the official language of their country, meaning if the Kurds will insist to teach their own language in the future, he has the potential to do some things in this case. Regarding Israel, Article number 1, no part of it may be relinquished, no part of the Syrian territory, meaning a hint for the Golan Heights. If he will feel secure enough to resume tension, he can definitely do it. But this text contains not only powerful tools regarding external and internal threats, it has also tools to implement values, implement Islamist values. In the question, for example, of women, let's take, for example, Article number 10 that deals the case of equality. Citizens are equal before the law in rights and duties. Sounds good. Citizens are equal, but they are equal before the law. But this is a kind of a paradox, because what you should do if the law that based on Islam, on the Sharia, what you should do if the Sharia itself orders inequality in rights and duties between men and women in cases of marriage, divorce, and inheritance. What you should do if a woman should inherit only half of the share of her brother. So it's a good question, and they have a full potential to implement these values, but not only in the case of rights, only and also in the case of duties. Article 20, the family. The family is the nucleus of the society, and the state is committed to protecting it. So the idea of family is the nucleus, the basic brick, the cornerstone of the society is a classical Islamist idea, not as in the liberal state that sees the individual is the cornerstone, but the family is the cornerstone. And Article 21, the state shall preserve the social status of women, protect their dignity, meaning a dress code, and their role within the family and society. Again, their role within the family and society, meaning they should take care of the family when the man is going out to work. So this constitution emphasizes the traditional gender division between men and women in cases of rights and duties. So what about the political arena? This text enables them a lot of power. So it's very natural to see that he is the head of the executive authority, Article 31, the president exercises executive power, Article 32, the president is the supreme commander of army and armed forces. It's very natural. But what about the other authorities. What about the legislative authority? Article 24. The president shall form a higher committee to select members that shall select 2/3 of the members of the parliament. And number 3, the president of the republic appoints 1/3 of the members of the parliament. So eventually, the president elects directly 1/3 of the members of the parliament, and indirectly the other 2/3 of the members of the parliament, meaning that in the end of the day, he has the potential to control the majority of the parliament. So he controls the executive as well as the legislative authority. And by the way, this interim constitution does not mention the word democracy, neither the Syrian people as the sovereign source of power. And it's not a coincidence because, as I said earlier, it was Abdul-Rahim Atwan that used to speak against the concept of democracy. But what about the other authority, the judicial authority? Article 43, the judiciary is independent and judges are subject only to the law. Which law? The law that's compatible to Islam based on the Supreme Council of Fatwa. Article 47, the Constitutional Court. A new Supreme Constitutional Court shall be established, and the Supreme Constitutional Court shall consist of 7 members appointed by the president. They shall be experienced and regulated by the law. Which law? The law that approved by those jurists. And eventually, if the president appoints those 7 members of the Constitutional Court, it means that he controls also the judicial authority. So eventually, he controls the 3 branches of the government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. So, just to wrap it up, so far, if we are reading the text, besides the soft and rhetorics so far, there are no evidence of signs of ideological compromises. There are no evidence that he left his beliefs, he left his vision. He has a full potential to resume tensions if needed. He's paving the way, this text also, to a future theocracy in Syria. And if needed, if he will feel secure enough in the future, he has the potential to resume tension internally against the minorities, externally, for example, against Israel. Will he do it? Frankly, I don't know. But what I do know, that he has the full potential, based on this text, to do whatever he wants in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Nahmias. Does anyone have any question for Mr. Nahmias before we move on?
I was just wondering what is the point of drafting the Constitution that's not intending to be a democracy? Why? Who is the Constitution for?
I'm not convinced that he wants real democracy, and it's not a coincidence that he didn't mention the word democracy, but it's a tool to mark a line that there is a new Syria. It's a tool in order to gain legitimacy, mainly externally, but also internally. And it's a tool to mark that starting from now, I'm the president, there is a new regime, there are new rules in Syria, but not for building new democracy in Syria. I'm not convinced.
Excuse me. Thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. My question is, do you think that Ahmad al-Shara is a new edition of pragmatic Islamic entity all around the world? Do you think he will survive with the modern image that he tries to give the world about Islam?
It's a good question. He's trying to do his best is trying to do his best in order to currently to ease tensions within Syria in order to gain legitimacy and then to have control over the parts of the Kurds, of the Druze, of the Alawites, in order to build this image internally. And externally is more important in order to regain the legitimacy internally, because if the vast majority of the Syrian people will see that he is acceptable in the international arena, it might help him internally in future Syria. Will he left his vision? I'm not convinced, but he is open enough in order to delay it to the far future, I think.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. I think I wanted to mention one thing about the Supreme Council. One of their main movements has been to revenge killings. And I think that when you look at the minimalist versus maximalist concepts, it seems like so far they've started with a more minimalist approach. And so, yes, I agree that the danger of the wording is very open-ended, but might be optimistic or cautiously optimistic, saying that so far the rulings have mainly focused on trying to prevent violence as opposed to, say, promote violence.
You're right. It's a very unique combination, the Supreme Council of Fatwa, because some people think that he chose Osama Rifai as the face of the Supreme Council of Fatwa as an acceptable face. He considered is a more how do you say, moderate mufti or more moderate jurist. However, this is a combination of part of very important figures for Shah himself, such as Atwan, and other figures that would be more acceptable in the internal arena within Syria. So far, they are trying to ease the fears. However, in the far future, it's an interesting question because, for example, Atwan himself changed his look. He also started to wear uniform, and also Mazar al-Wais changed his look. He's walking with uniform. So right now they are adopting the same measures, the same tactic in order to ease the fears. But again, the potential is there to change the direction in future Syria. I'm not familiar a lot with it, but some people think that it's not a coincidence that he chose Osama Rifai as the head of the Supreme Council of Fatwa as a man who is related to the Muslim Brotherhood, as a hint of 1979 and the massive attack against the Muslim Brotherhood back then. So just to signal that we are taking a different direction to future Syria. But this is completely different story between Ashara and 1979 of Hafez al-Assad. So I think that the main concern of Ashara currently is in order to retake all of Syria, first of all, and then to have the maximum means, the maximum help externally in order to control Syria. So currently he's not dealing with the Syrian refugees. It's a future question regarding Syria or any other ruler in Syria.
Thank you. There's been a discourse around influences on Shah himself,
Mm-hmm.
that he wants to maybe go out from under the thumb of Turkish influence, maybe more towards the West, and his opposition towards Hezbollah. And so how do you think about this influence on him?
Mm-hmm. I think that currently he uses Turkey. There's kind of symbiosis between Turkey and Ashara himself. I think that he uses Turkey as a bridge to outside. Turkey is a tool in order to signal that I'm here, I'm the legitimate leader, and you might help me, even militarily, you might help me in order to retake Syria again. But about the future of Syria, if Turkey necessarily will be the most important player for Ashara, I'm not sure. But so far, it's very fruitful for him to use Turkey, to have good ties with Turkey, as well as with other countries, I think like Qatar, for example. But in the future, it's an open question. In the near future, he can make some security arrangements with Israel, and he's talking with Israel regarding it, as Syria just did after Yom Kippur War in 74. So he has the legitimacy, or he tries in order to gain this legitimacy in order to reach a security agreements with Israel as a tool to retake Syria and to gain legitimacy mainly in Washington. However, in the far future, as Article number 1 mentioned directly, no part of the Syrian territory will be relinquished, so he has the potential to resume tension and to claim later on the Golan Heights are still occupied by Israel, and therefore I'm committed to do the same as Assad did, for example. Currently, it would be very useful for him to have any understandings with Israel in order to gain Trump for his side.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Nahmias, once again for the detailed constitutional analysis. The legal and institutional frameworks you've outlined will certainly shape Syria's political future. We now move on to our final speaker in this session, who is former Ambassador Arkady Milman, a senior researcher and head of the Russia program at the Institute for National Security Studies. Ambassador Milman served as Israeli ambassador to Russia from 2003 to 2006, and as Israeli ambassador to Azerbaijan from 1997 to 2000. His diplomatic experience provides unique insights into Russian foreign policy in the region. Former Ambassador Milman will discuss the future of Syrian-Russian relations. I leave the floor to you, former Ambassador Milman.
I have no presentation, I'm sorry. So it's a pleasure to be here with you today. And in this presentation, I will be discussing Russia and Syria after the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, and from patronage to presence management, Russia's damage control strategy and regime change, conflict, and the future of the Russian-Syrian relations. So the end of Assad-centric era is a transformation of the Russian strategy. The fall of Bashar al-Assad regime in December 24 marked a major turning point for both Syria and the Russian Middle East policy. For over a decade, Syria has been central to Moscow regional strategy, hosting its Eastern Mediterranean military presence, symbolizing Russia's return to the Middle East and demonstrating its commitment to protecting allies during ongoing rivalry with the West. The regime's collapse exposed the limits of this patronage model. Russia lost its key client, but did not abandon Syria as a strategically important arena. Rather than a simple geopolitical defeat, the episode signaled a shift in Russian engagement from personalized regime patronage toward the risk management and the maintenance of minimal influence under growing constraint. A serious new leadership under Ahmad al-Shara advanced a strategy of foreign policy diversification. Russia adopted accordingly and rendering Russian-Syrian relations in 24-25 a clear illustration of Moscow's broader transition from patronage to presence management. And now theoretical framework. The presentation analyzed Russian-Syrian relations in the post-Assad period through four interrelated theoretical perspectives. First, neorealism provides the overarching structural framework, emphasizing how shifts in material capabilities and systemic constraints, particularly the war in Ukraine, and the accumulating effects of Western sanctions, reduced Russia's capacity to maintain an expansive patronage model and shaped its willingness and ability to support Assad in 2024. Second, the concept of strategic hedging is used to explain Moscow's adaptive behavior after Assad's fall, reflected in its maintenance of working level channels with Syria's new leadership, retention of legal and political instruments of pressure, and reluctance to fully normalize relations with actors associated with HTS. Third, the concept of damage control aptly describes Russia's post-collapse strategy, which focused on limiting losses and safeguarding key assets, such as military bases, economic footholds, and diplomatic relevance, after the failure of a decade-long investment in sustaining assets rule. Finally, the framework of multi-alignment situates these dynamics within Syria's own post-Assad orientation toward flexible, non-exclusive cooperation with multiple power centers, in which Russia, out of necessity rather than choice, remains a significant but no longer hegemonic partner. Now, Russia and Syria, 2015-2024, from intervention to institutional presence. Russia's military intervention in Syria, launched in September 2015, was its first large-scale, long-term expeditionary operations since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. This operation aimed not only at counter-terrorism, but at preserving a friendly regime, restoring Russia's military stature, and offering an alternative to Western regime change interventions. Militarily, Russian air power and advisory support halted opposition advance and enabled Damascus to regain key cities and corridors. Long-term agreements secure 49-year access to Tartus naval facility and the Khmeimim air base. This institutionalized Moscow influence, with Khmeimim becoming a regional logistic hub. Economically, Russian firms gained access to phosphate resources to port of Tartus and parts of Syria's energy and chemical sectors, allowing Moscow by the early 2020s to monopolize external patronage over the Assad regime. However, this model depended on Assad's survival and limited external competition. And once these conditions eroded, the Assad-centered architecture proved far more fragile than anticipated. December 2024, the decision not to save the regime. The rapid advance of HTS in early December 2024 forced Moscow to confront a stark strategic choice. De facto, two options remained. One, a dramatic escalation aimed at saving Assad, entailing substantial additional deployments, financial costs, and long-term obligations. Or second, a shift to a loss mitigation strategy, which accepts that regime change while seeking to preserve core Russian assets. Moscow chose the latter. From a neorealist perspective, this was a rational cost-benefit choice. The war in Ukraine strained Russia's military capacity. The Assad regime was clearly weakened, and continued support promised diminishing strategic returns. According to statement by Ahmad Ashara and several analytical assessments, a tacit understanding emerged as 88 advanced. Russian forces would not intervene in the decisive phase of the fighting, and return in advancing force would refrain from targeting Russian bases or personnel. This informal arrangement marked an early transition from patronage to damage control. Moscow's immediate priority shifted from defending an allied regime to protecting its own infrastructure, military footholds, and potential channels of influence in a fundamentally altered political environment. Russia as a damage control actor, three dimensions of transformation. First, the military dimension. After Assad's fall, Russia kept its military presence in Syria, but its role changed significantly. The Tartus and Khmeimim bases remained active. However, they shift from instruments of direct involvement in the civil war to logistical hubs and strategic insurance assets within Russia's wider regional posture. At the same time, Russia redeployed part of its personnel and equipment to other theaters, especially Libya and Sahel. This reduced costs in Syria while maintaining a minimal footprint sufficient not for influence and signaling. The second, the political dimension. Politically, Moscow adopted a cautious, ambivalent approach. It refrained from fully recognizing the new Syrian authorities, kept HTS designated as a terrorist organization, and avoided revising early conflict narratives, while at the same time re-establishing working level channels with Damascus. This dual strategy reflects strategic hedging, enabling Russia to acknowledge new realities without full commitment and to retain leverage and flexibility as Syria's internal dynamics evolve. And the third, the economic dimension. After Assad's fall, the economic sphere became the main foundation of Russia's continued presence in Syria. Russia focused on practical activities such as access to phosphate production, involvement in port and infrastructure projects, and limited participation in the energy sector. These forms of engagement required less political commitment and were less affected by change in leadership than military or ideological ties. As a result, economic cooperation offered Russia a relatively low-cost way to remain relevant in Syria, despite fewer resources and growing competition. The first post-Assad phase, it was winter-spring 2025, estrangement and contraction. In the months after Assad's fall, Russian-Syrian relations were marked by estrangement and mutual distrust, as Moscow was closely associated with the former regime. Also, Russian forces were not expelled. Their presence was sharply reduced. Troops withdrew to coastal bases, mobility was restricted, and access to Tartus was delayed. Russia also lost several key economic contracts. Tensions increased further in March 2025 during clashes on the coast involving Alawite communities. During these events, Russia sheltered thousands of civilians at Khmeimim, showing its continued engagement with minority groups and further complicating relations with Damascus. By early 2025, Russia's influence has narrowed largely to its coastal bases, and despite signaling willingness to cooperate, its initial outreach failed to overcome persistent suspicion. A new phase, pragmatic normalization, summer and autumn 2025. A more substantive shift occurred during the summer of 2025. A combination of Russian initiatives and developments within Syria itself pushed both sides to develop a more pragmatic accommodation and a gradual normalization of relations, particularly in security domain. Revising and adapting the contractual framework. From early 2025, Moscow began confidence-building measures. This includes shipments of wheat and fuel, a high-level foreign ministry delegation, and direct contacts between Presidents Putin and al-Shara. Russia proposed expanded economic and humanitarian cooperations, such as restoring energy infrastructure, increasing aid, and potentially using Khmeimim and Tartus as humanitarian hubs. This proposal explicitly acknowledged the new political reality and accepted the need to reconsider agreements signed under Assad. These steps laid the groundwork for the revising the bilateral contractual framework, with Moscow signaling openness to renegotiate energy, phosphate infrastructure, and logistic deals without reversing prior privileges. For Damascus, this enabled an end to visible Assad-era dependence on Russia while retaining limited economic ties. Shift toward non-political, low-profile cooperation. At the same time, Russian diplomacy emphasized low-profile, non-political cooperation in areas such as energy restoration, water networks, transport infrastructure, and food and fuel deliveries. This strategy repositioned Russia as a technical partner, supporting basic state functions rather than a political patron. This depoliticized approach reduced reputational risk for Moscow while enabling Damascus to frame cooperation with Russia as part of diversified foreign policy rather than renewed asymmetric dependence. Security returns to the agenda, and of course there was an important milestone was Russia's support for UN Security Council resolution lifting personal sanctions on Ahmad al-Shara and several other members of the new Syrian leadership. And Moscow justified this step as necessary to protect Syria's territorial integrity, ease the humanitarian crisis, and recognize the changed political reality. Indeed, the core element of Moscow emerging strategy was the deliberate maintenance of legal ambiguity. HTS remained on Russia's national list of terrorist organizations, yet Moscow expanded contacts with Syrian new authorities, including at the highest level. And this dual approach served several purposes. It functioned as a safeguard and sources of leverage vis-à-vis Damascus, while also signaling to Western actors that Russia formally remained within an anti-terrorist framework. And at the same time, it gave Moscow flexibility in a context where Syrian authorities themselves were recalibrating their relations with former radical structures. From a strategic hedging perspective, the ambiguity allowed Russia to preserve the widest range of options while avoiding binding commitments. And security returns to the agenda. In mid-2025, security issues returned to the forefront of the bilateral agenda. A new wave of violence in southern Syria, including clashes between the pro-regime Bedouin forces and the Druze community, prompted demonstrative Israeli strike in the heart of Damascus, carried out in broad daylight as a signal of readiness to intervene to protect minorities. This episode sharpened Damascus' perception of external security threats and highlighted the limits of its own deterrent capability. Against this backdrop, Syrian authorities began to view Russia as a potentially useful external security partner. Approximately 2 weeks after the Israeli strike, on 31 July 2025, Syria's foreign and defense minister visited Russia for the first time and met inter alia with President Putin. It subsequently emerged that Damascus was interested in the return of Russian forces to southern Syria, near the border with Israel, resembling the configuration in which Russian military police had been deployed during the Assad era as a means of constraining Israeli operations. From that moment, the security component became a central theme in Russian-Syrian discussions. While Damascus sought to enlist Russian assistance, Moscow primarily used these proposals as leverage to improve its position on issues viewed as vital, especially the status of its bases. Intensification of military technical engagement and the Shara-Putin summit. Questions of security coordinations, the legal status of Russian bases, assistance in rebuilding the Syrian army, and the potential redeployment of Russian units were discussed during an interagency delegation led by Russian Deputy Minister Novak in Damascus in September 2025. In early October, a Ministry of Defense delegation visited Syria to discuss, among other things, the enhancement of military readiness and maintenance of equipment. In parallel, the Syrian Chief of Staff traveled to Moscow to explore options for arms procurement and operational coordination. The high point of this tightening relationship was a Shara visit to Moscow on 15 October 2025 and the ceremonially staged reception hosted by President Putin. During the meeting, the Syrian president stated that existing agreements between the two states would be honored, implicitly indicating an intention to preserve Russian-based rights on the coast in line with Moscow's interests. At the same time, it was evident that Ashara did not intend to grant Russia the level of influence it had enjoyed during the Assad era, as part of his broader strategy of diversifying external support, including relations with the Trump administration, Turkey, Gulf states, and others. Subsequent contacts continued this trajectory. At the end of October, the Syrian defense minister again visited Moscow to discuss bilateral military cooperation. In mid-November, the Russian deputy defense minister traveled to Damascus, and a joint Russian-Syrian military delegation toured Quneitra province in southern Syria, a strong indicator that the idea of a renewed Russian deployment in the area was moving toward practical implementation. Taken together, these developments show that by late 2025, Russia and Syria had moved beyond initial estrangement toward pragmatic, security-centered partnership, narrower and less ideological than the Assad-era alliance, yet more structured and resilient than the immediate post-revolutionary period. And now a comparative perspective, Afghanistan is a comparable case. Russia's policy toward Afghanistan following the Taliban's return to power reveals a broadly similar logic of adaptation. After decades of strongly negative use of the Taliban, Moscow gradually moved toward establishing contacts, expanding political dialogue, and de facto recognizing the new authorities as the key actor in Afghanistan, even while legal formalization and official rhetoric remained deliberately cautious. This trajectory reflected the combination of damage control and strategic hedging. Russia sought to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a source of uncontrolled security risk for Central Asia and its own southern flank, while avoiding deep and costly commitments. It accepted the new power realities, built working relations with former adversaries, and attempted to embed its presence in a way that preserved options and minimized exposure. The Syrian case follows a similar pattern, but over a much shorter period of time. In both Syria and Afghanistan, Russia did not withdraw after a change of regime. Instead, it adjusted its role by moving away from directly supporting one specific government and toward maintaining a more limited, practical presence under new authorities. This similarity suggests that Russia is developing a recurring approach to dealing with regime change. And now, prospect for Russian-Syrian relations, the emergence of a post-patronage model. In the medium term, it appears unlikely that Russian-Syrian relations will return to the form of strategic patronage that characterized the Assad era. At the same time, a complete degradation of bilateral ties into merely symbolic or marginal interaction also seems improbable. Rather, the available empirical evidence and analytical assessment suggests the consolidation of a post-patronage model characterized by limited commitments, functional cooperation, and low political density. On the Russian side, both material capabilities and strategic incentives for reconstructing an exclusive dominant role in Syria are absent. The competition for resources driven by the war in Ukraine, they need to manage multiple theaters, including the South Caucasus, Libya, and the Sahel, and the cost of sustaining high-profile alliances, all militate against a return to the ambitious patronage strategies of the mid-2010s. On the Syria side, the new leadership continues to signal its determination to avoid dependence on any single external actor. It favors a multi-actor configuration of partnership in which Turkey, the Gulf states, the United States, China, and Russia each perform distinct but not exclusive functions. Within this configuration, Russia is neither central nor dispensable. It is one of several external stakeholders whose presence must be managed and balanced. In this context, Syria remains significant for Moscow primarily as a space for managed military presence, diplomatic access and regional signaling rather than a platform for large-scale political engineering or leadership in post-war reconstruction. This orientation corresponds to Russia's broader adaptation to resource constraints and competing strategic priorities. For its part, Damascus operates on a logic of selective utility. Russia is not perceived as a guarantor of a new political order, but neither it considered an actor whose presence can be entirely dispensed with. Moscow continues to serve limited yet meaningful functions, contributing to regional security configurations, supporting diversification of external relations, and providing technical or infrastructural assistance without stringent political conditionality. The new relationship between Russia and Syria can be described as durable but shallow. Cooperation is likely to continue, but only in a limited number of practical areas, such as the use of military bases, selected military technical support, specific economic projects, and diplomatic contacts. Unlike during the Assad era, this relationship does not involve deep institutional ties, shared ideology, or strong dependence on one side. In this sense, the future of Russian-Syrian relation is best understood not as a trajectory toward full reintegration or progressive withdrawal, but as the consolidation of a presence management regime in which Russian influence remains partial, conditional, and continuously renegotiated. In conclusion, the Syrian case highlights an important shift in the character of Russian foreign policy under structural constraints and systemic pressures. Russia is gradually ceasing to operate as a patron power responsible for the survival of specific regimes, and it's increasingly acting as a manager of presence, seeking to preserve core assets and influence while minimizing costs. This is not a strategy of expansion or demonstrative victories. It's a strategy of holding ground, mitigating losses, and managing risk in an environment where attempts to protect an ally at any cost have become prohibitively expensive and strategically inefficient. Post-Assad Syria becomes a laboratory for this adaptive policy, illustrating how Moscow recalibrates its role in the aftermath of regime collapse. Parallels with Russia's evolving approach to the Taliban in Afghanistan underscore the repeatability and durability of the underlying pattern. In both theaters, Moscow responded to the loss of long-standing partner by accepting the new political reality, building working relations with former adversaries, and embedding its presence in a narrower but more sustainable form. In both the Syrian and Afghan cases, Russia followed a similar underlying strategy that combines damage control with strategic hedging. When regimes changed, Moscow chose not to withdraw completely, but to adjust, but working with new partners instead. This approach, rather than strict loyalty to former allies or sudden disengagement, marks Russia's shift from supporting specific regimes to managing a continued presence, and it helps explain how Russia now operates in environments shaped by regime change in the 2020s. Thank you.
Thank you, former Ambassador Millman. The Russian dimension is definitely crucial to understanding Syria's geopolitical position. We have time for one or two questions before we break. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, sir. So, over the last week, we have seen a flow of Turkish troops in large columns into Syria. And Russia and Turkey clashed over Syria before to shut down a Russian jet. How do you see the two over Syria after the revolution?
What do you mean?
The Turkish-Russian confrontation in Syria.
Confrontation or cooperation, maybe? And this is interesting because there were some contacts between Russia and the Turkish leadership to some kind of adjustment for the new situation. And this contact also were important for Russian side because Turkish leadership enabled Russian officials to contact Syrian new leadership. So I don't think that it will be confrontation. It will be cooperation with Russian and Syrian units in Syria.
Okay, one last question. Go ahead.
Domino effects of the collapse of Israel, coordinated with Russia, with its freedom of actions in the Syrian airspace. It had to coordinate with Russia because Russia had control over the airspace in southern Syria. Now, because Russia, that's not a factor anymore, doesn't have control. Do you think that this allows Israel to move closer to Ukraine? Because it doesn't have to appease Russia as much to have the action in Syria?
Please repeat what the point of Ukraine? I didn't understand.
Can Israel move closer to Ukraine because it doesn't need to coordinate with Russia anymore with its action?
Yes, okay, I understand. This was the perception of the Israeli political establishment. Okay. It was a perception of the Israeli political and military establishment that we have to be neutral toward the Ukrainian case. And that was because of three important pillars. One is the Russian presence, military presence in Syria. Second, the Jewish community, the security of the Jewish community in Moscow. And the third, in my opinion, it was psychological fear of Russian bear. What will happen? Russia will do something. If we try to do or say something, Russia will react. Something will happen. And nothing happened. One, there was a deconfliction mechanism during the civil war in Syria, during till the December of 2024, and nothing happened. Second, there was some, I will say, cognitive dissonance, and I will explain. Security of the Russian Jewish community is so important, I agree. But what about the security of the Ukrainian Jewish community that every day Russia bombs Ukraine? And there is a big problem with the security of the Jewish community in Ukraine. No one word was said by Israeli leadership, and it is a shame. It is a shame. No one word. So in this situation, I think that it was a big, big mistake. Now, do you think that Russia still is a great power? I'm not sure. We are 4 years there, the war in Ukraine, and still Russia can't achieve Putin's goals? No. So maybe Russia is not so strong. Maybe Russia it's not a superpower. Maybe Russia is a regional power. So this fear of Israeli military and political establishment, it was some kind of illusion. Now, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Gideon Sar, visited Kiev in the summer this year. And he said loudly that there were military crimes, Russian military crimes in Ukraine. And what happened? Do you know what happened? Nothing. Even one word Russian didn't say. Even one word. But didn't blame, nothing. So maybe it's in some way it's evidence that this fear, psychological fear, it's a problematic issue. Now, always you need, when you are in the decision-making process, you need political willingness to do something. And in all this case of Ukraine, if we try to analyze the policy of Israel government, it was based on some fear that today we see that it was some kind of misunderstanding. Nothing happened. So this is the question. Now, our prime minister a few days ago said in Knesset that he had contacts with Putin, and Russia is the world superpower. So this is the contradictions and maybe also misunderstanding. Russia, it's not, it's maybe a regional superpower, not friendly country to Israel, not friendly. And it's important to understand. And still our government, I'm sorry that I have to criticize it, but still our government is in some illusion that Russia could be neutral actor. No, Russia is not neutral actor in the Middle East, and especially not toward Israel.
Okay. Thank you so much, former Ambassador Milman. Okay, welcome back, everyone. Before we actually start with the second session, as most of you may know, tonight we will be starting off the Hanukkah celebrations. So we will be lighting up the Hanukkah. So we will be starting with the bracha. ברוך אתה השם אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו במצוותיו וציוונו להדליק נר של חנוכה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. Now we'll be moving on to our second session, which will be shifting focus to examining the relationship between Israel and Syria. This is perhaps the most pressing question for those of us in this room. What possibilities exist for peace, normalization, or at least stability between our two countries? We have two distinguished speakers who will be addressing this question from different but complementary perspectives. So first, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Eyal Zisser. He is the Vice Rector of Tel Aviv University and holder of the Yona and Dina Ettinger Chair in Contemporary History of the Middle East. Professor Zisser has written extensively on the history and modern politics of Syria and Lebanon and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Zisser will be addressing the question, can Israel and Syria reach a peace agreement? Professor Zisser, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. The simple answer is yes, but probably that's not what will happen. But first of all, allow me to congratulate Carl for this marvelous achievement, publication of his book, actually the publication of the Arabic translation of his book, which deals with an historical episode, what seemed to be an historical episode that lacked any relevance to Syria of today, but nevertheless, I would like to suggest that speaking about the rise and fall of Greater Syria, the fall, but listening to Tom Barak, the American enemy, speaking about the possibility of annexing Lebanon to Syria. So here we are again with these themes and these ideas. We first heard about the idea of Greater Syria from Anton Saade, and then it was mainly Patrick Seal who argued that Assad's policy is all about achieving this goal of bringing back to life Greater Syria or Bilad al-Sham. And then when we think of Ahmed al-Shara, or at that time Abu Muhammad al-Julani, he and before him Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, referred to Bilad al-Sham. I mean, ISIS is all about the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, but the Arabic term is Sham, referring to Bilad al-Sham, referring to Greater Syria. So I think this term has still relevance to Syria of today. But let me address the question, can Israel and Syria reach peace agreement? And I'll start with an interesting report published in Yediot Achronot this last Friday. I don't know if you read or noticed. It was an interview with the commander of the regional division of IDF, which is deployed in the Golan Heights. And he said in this interview, I prefer, well, the exact translation is, I prefer noise over misleading quiet. This is to say, I prefer the military engagement and occupation or the deployment of Israeli forces inside Syrian territory. I prefer this situation where we don't have any agreement with the Syrian authorities over a situation where we have an agreement, we have even peace, but we really do not trust the other side. And I think this is basically, this was, by the way, the Israeli policy in 73. We prefer the status quo rather than have progress in the peace negotiations or the political process with Egypt, and this is this was the Israeli position regarding Hamas. Or the Palestinian question in 2023, we prefer the status quo rather than have some sort of a political process and a progress in this process, and this is right now the policy, of course, of the military establishment, but also of the, I think, Israeli establishment in large. Why do we need peace with Syria at all right now? It's better to stay where we are. It's better than to have an agreement. And if this is your basic approach, how can we speak of, a peace agreement that can be or cannot be reached between Israel and Syria? Well, this topic, so many books were written. It's in Hebrew because it's taken from a lecture I gave to an Israeli audience, but, the lost peace, as my own mentor, my own professor, Itamar Rabinovich, wrote in his famous book referring to the Israeli-Syrian negotiations after the 48 war, and they call it the road not taken. It's very interesting. What do you mean, the road not taken? I mean, the title of the book in English is, in Hebrew, it's Shalom Shechamas. Okay? Basic peace, or the peace that escaped from us, but he preferred or choose this title for the English version, probably because it has to do with, everybody has in mind this famous poem, but when you call your book the road not taken, somebody didn't take this road. Okay, so already in 48, we had maybe an opportunity to achieve something, maybe not peace, but the road was not taken, both by Israel and by the Syrian. Well, as you all know, peace negotiations, the serious peace negotiations, because after the Baas coup in March 63 and the rise to power of Hafez al-Assad, the option of peace was not really on the table. Was not really on the table. The Syrian position, even before 67, even before the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights, was very clear. We are not ready to not only negotiate peace with Israel, but to recognize the right of Israel to exist here and to establish peaceful relations with Israel. I do remind you that Syria rejected the UN resolution, the Security Council resolution 242. It had to do with, you know, the Arabs will, Israel will give back the territories it occupied, or territories it occupied in 67, and the Arabs will sign a peace agreement with Israel, and it was rejected by Syria, because Syria refused to consider, even to accept, the idea of having peaceful relations with Israel, recognizing Israel's right to exist here. The dramatic change, of course, there were changes before. The Syrians spoke about a political process already following the Yom Kippur, the October War in 73, but clearly the dramatic change happened in 91, the Madrid conference, where both sides started negotiating for peace. I still have 5 minutes, right? Yeah. Okay. Now, what I would like to say is that this was a major change in the Syrian position, and it was said very clearly in 2000, or actually 99, in the White House, when then Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and then Syrian Foreign Minister Farouk Shar, a relative of Ahmed Shar, they both come from the Shar family in southern Syria. Well, Farouk Shar said very clearly, I mean, we are ready to transfer this conflict with Israel, this struggle, which was existential about the existence. I mean, we were not ready to recognize the right of Israel to exist here. We are ready to change or actually a change did happen, and now we are not speaking in terms of existential conflict, but territorial conflict. I mean, conflict over borders. And this was a dramatic change in the Syrian position, and the two sides start negotiating for peace. These negotiations lasted almost 20 years, 2 decades, from 91 till the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011. In March 2011, the two sides were engaged, were committed. Of course, there were ups and downs, failures, setbacks, but the process continued. The process continued, and there were points where we indeed very close to achieve peace. There are those who will say 95 or early 96. There are those who will say 2000 under Ehud Barak. There are those who will say 2007 under Ehud Olmert. And eventually we were not able to achieve this target. And when you look at the reasons, I mean, not when you look at the reasons, when you read the Israeli and the American Testament of those Israelis and Americans who took part, who participated in those negotiations, and speak or write, most of them in their memoirs, about the reason why we didn't achieve peace with Syria. They don't blame the Syrians. They do say they had a problem with the Israeli side, who was ready but couldn't deliver, taking into consideration the domestic politics inside Israel. This is the argument here made by Martin Indyk, but also by Uri Sagi, who had the peace delegations under Ehud Barak. But I think there is something more basic here. Yeah. Now, if you look at this event, it was 2007, 2007 or 2008. It was in the 8th, yes. It was the Bastille Day in Paris, the gathering of many leaders of from the Mediterranean, I mean, who came to the annual meeting hosted by President Sarkozy, I think, at that time. And if you see, just a minute.
Il est presque devant lui. Hein.
Now you can see.
À quelle verse de gauche de Holmer? Tu vois pas? Il y a 3 personnes entre eux.
Ehud Olmert and Bashar al-Assad.
Allez, grouille, grouille, hein.
Well, as you can see, the difference is
Aïe, 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 il va aller.
difference of one chair.
Et où là? Il s'est tourné à ça. Oh, il
This is the Amir of Qatar.
Moubarak. Allez, où tonton?
Now it's only Mubarak
Allez, il s'est tourné. Hein.
separate them, and
Ah, il a fait oh.
Olmert said, you know, I will not force him to shake my hand.
J'aurais dû mettre le 300 mm dedans.
Now you see.
Que Moubarak doit prendre. Aïe, 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 quel scénario.
Now nobody separated.
Ah, mais là, il l'a vu. Ah, il s'est
But okay. Now why do I show it to you? Because you know, at that time they were engaged in peace negotiations, serious peace negotiations, and Olmert. It was before his departure from office, but Olmert sent Assad a clear message: I'm ready to give you all what you want. I mean, this is the full Israeli withdrawal to the 4th of June 67 lines, and yet they, mainly the Syrian president, was not able to bring himself to shake hands with the internal enemy. And I think this shows us partly the reason why we didn't achieve peace with Syria. My answer, and this is the very simple answer, and unfortunately I don't have time to elaborate about it, but I mean, of course, there was a big gap, not a big, this was a question of 10, 20 meters, yes, but a gap between the Israeli and the Egyptian and the Syrian position. This was quite clear from the beginning. There was a problem of something we didn't have in 77, moving ahead in two fronts, the Palestinian front or the Israeli-Palestinian track and the Syrian track. And one thing I think Yitzhak Rabin explained me once was that it's interesting to find out that there are those in Israel who want peace with the Palestinians and are ready to give even Eastern Jerusalem but they are not are ready to give the Golan Heights, give up the Golan Heights. And there are those, I mean, the settlers in the Golan Heights are very moderate. Most of them in those elections in 96, in 2000, voted for the Labour, I mean, pragmatic. And most of them were moderate, and most of them were ready to give up the entire West Bank. But when it came to the Golan Heights, they had a different position. And trying to move ahead on these two fronts, you unite two blocks in the within the Israeli constituency, those who oppose the peace or any progress in the peace process with the Palestinians, and those who oppose any progress in the peace process or giving back the Golan Heights. And this was too much for Barak, this was too much for Rabin, so many problems, but I think the basic problem is that in 77, Sadat, followed by Begin, decided that he wants to make peace. And his message was very clear. If you read memoirs of, Ismail Fahmy, his assistants, his diplomats, his ministers, I decided to make peace with Israel. You can negotiate the terms or the technicalities, but you should know I decided to make peace with Israel because I need this peace. I want this peace. And he was followed by Begin, who sent the same message to the Israelis. This didn't happen in our case. Both sides were ready to consider the possibility of signing peace, and this was a major achievement, of course. And Assad's message was very clear. Yes, I'm ready to consider the possibility. I might at the end sign this agreement. But it's not that I made up my mind. We should discuss, we should negotiate, we should look into the terms. And I want peace, but I don't need it really seriously, and I can live without peace. And this was exactly the situation with the Israeli government that was ready to make peace with the Syrians, that wanted, but there was no hunger, there was no eagerness like we saw in 77. The two sides were ready to consider peace, but not as they wanted. They were eager to achieve this goal in 70s. But this is old history, and now we are getting to Syria of today. The fall of Bashar al-Assad surprised everybody, surprised Bashar, surprised the Iranians, surprised the Russians, surprised Hezbollah, surprised, of course, also Israel, and I think Ahmed Shara himself, who didn't expect this attack, Raid al-Wudan, to be as successful as it was. And now Israel is facing the question, what next? Now, Shara from the early moment, from the first moment he entered his new palace, sent a very clear message: Syria is a ruined country. Yes, I used to belong to ISIS, but I have changed. I mean, people do change. And I shouldn't be judged according to what I said or did 20, 25 years ago, but according to what I say and do right now. Syria is their own country. I don't have an army. I do not threaten anyone, and my clear interest is to rebuild Syria, and I want to live in peace and reach security agreements, and maybe in the future even peace with all of my neighbors. To this, the Israeli response was quite clear: we do not trust you, and since we are the most powerful country in this region of the Levant, why should we listen to you? I mean, of course, the immediate reaction was the fall of the regime may create a threat. This is why the immediate response was to capture territories in the Syrian territory. And then once you capture these territories, you fall in love with them. That's always what happened to Israel. And then why to give up these territories? Now, careful approach is needed, but I think that the Israeli policy is dictated by the domestic policy. On the one hand, the pressure of the Druze community in Israel, that Israel should look at what is happening to the Druze community in Syria. And this is logical. I mean, what is happening inside Syria, the approach of the current regime to the minority show that basically it's going to be some sort of an Islamic regime. Not necessarily like ISIS, but like the Emirates, like Erdogan in Turkey, like Saudi Arabia, Islamic regime where the place of the position of the minority is being questioned. But of course, there is the question, is the role of Israel to take off the entire Middle East? But there is the pressure clearly of the Druze community in Israel. And of course, there are the political consideration. I mean, among the constituency of this government, using force is always better than having stick, and use it is always better than speaking soft. And if this is the approach that is being accepted and encouraged by your voters, stick to it and act accordingly. And that's basically what we saw from early 2025. There are ongoing negotiations between Syrians and Israelis about achieving a security arrangements, about maybe moving ahead toward the possibility of signing peace, overcoming the main challenge of the future of the Golan Heights. But I don't think that Israel is right now interested in this process and in this path. And as I mentioned before, the interview of the commander of the Israeli division deployed in Golan Heights, it's better to show everyone that we are strong and rely on our strengths rather than on any political process. Having said so, of course, the one who takes decision right now in Israel is, of course, the one who sits in the White House. And he already decided that Ahmed Shara is a handsome guy and the good guy and the American guy in Syria. These serve American interests. And it may be that in the future the United States will dictate Israel, will tell Israel to reach some sort of security arrangement with the current regime. And as for peace, this will have to wait, but the Syrians as well as the Lebanese made it very clear. They are ready to negotiate peace. They are ready to sign a peace agreement with Israel, but of course in a much wider framework. I mean, let's finish the war in Gaza. Let us expand the Abraham Accords. Let's wait till Saudi Arabia will sign an agreement with Israel, and then we might join. I mean, Ahmed Shara's name was Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, and it's after the Golan Heights because his family came from the village Fik in southern Golan Heights, now held by Israel. So he knows from where his family came, came from, and he's committed, and still, this is not Hafez al-Assad, who lost the Golan Heights in 67 and was totally committed to the idea of bringing it back, because he was the one who lost it. And after almost 60 years, we hear no voices in Syria that suggest that this optical may overcome, especially if there is the American envoy, Tom Barak, who suggests to the Syrians that you'll get Lebanon instead of the Golan Heights. This is also a good idea. So, coming to the question, can we achieve peace with Syria? I think this is a possibility, this is an option. Both sides, mainly the Syrian side, is committed to this idea, but as always, it's a long road till we'll get there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Zisser, for that balanced assessment of the political and strategic considerations. We're now going to be moving forward to the final speaker, who is Dr. Ophir Winter. He's a senior researcher at the INSS and lecturer in the Department of Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Tel Aviv University. Dr. Winter is the author of 2 books, Zionism in Arab Discourses, co-authored with Prof. Uriah Shavit, and recently published Peace in the Name of Allah, Islamic Discourses und Treaties with Israel. Dr. Winter will discuss Islamic discourses and the potential for Syrian-Israeli peace. Dr. Winter, the floor is yours.
Until we have the presentation, I will take this opportunity to congratulate Carl again for his Arabic translation, his book, and to thank Carl and Uriah for organizing this very interesting event. So last week, as was mentioned before, it was the first anniversary of the Syrian revolution, and the new regime issued stamps, postage stamps, to commemorate this historic event. One of them featured an HTS elite unit fighter with a red headband. You can see it here, praying in the courtyard of the famous Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. This mosque that was mentioned also in the previous panel is considered by many as the 4th in its holiness in Islam. At the beginning of the Arab Spring, demonstrations against the regime of Bashar al-Assad erupted from this mosque, and it was there where Ashara delivered his victory speech after the city's liberation. So in the next 15-20 minutes, I do not presume to determine whether Ashara is a radical jihadist who views the liberation of Damascus as a stop on the way to Jerusalem, or whether he is a pragmatist seeking for a future peace and prosperity for his country. Peace with Israel, of course. I would rather like to argue 2 main points. Yes. So in the next 15-20 minutes, I want to argue 2 main points. The first is that much of the current Islamic discourse that produced by the religious institutions and clerics in Syria, both official and unofficial, about Israel, about the Jews, much of it is hostile. And it reminds very much the discourse of Islamist movements such as the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas, which we're all familiar with, and oppose peace treaties with Israel. Second, the second point is that such an Islamist discourse doesn't necessarily prevent the re-establishment of a military disengagement agreement, a security arrangement, like Professor Zisser said, between Israel and Syria. So let me start, let's see if it works, yes. Let me start with a very brief theoretical framework. What defines the Islamist approach to Israel? So since the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt in 1928, Islamists have consistently rejected a Jewish state in Palestine and opposed any peace agreements or normalization relations with Israel based on several arguments. First, Palestine is part of what is considered to be the Islamic nation. Second, Palestine, and especially Jerusalem, is seen sacred Muslim land until should stay like an endowment until the day of judgment, and giving any part of this land is forbidden in Islamic terms. Third, jihad to liberate Palestine is an individual duty, fard ain, for every capable Muslim. Fourth, Israel presents a military, cultural, and economic threat to the Islamic nation. And finally, Islamists often portray Jews as eternal enemies of Islam based on selected Quranic verses. You can see one of them here. And these Islamic notions that I mentioned make Jews and Israel unacceptable partners for peace with their neighbors. While Islamists reject permanent peace agreements with Israel based on previous arguments, they do not rule out a hudna, which is a temporary ceasefire, as a pragmatic interim solution. The main Islamic precedent for hudna is, of course, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. I will just say a few words about it for the people who don't familiar with it. In 628, Muhammad arrived at Hudaybiyah near Mecca with his followers, intending to perform the pilgrimage. An unaccepted incident, his camel refused to move according to the tradition, was interpreted as a divine sign to avoid bloodshed, leading him to negotiate with the people of Mecca and Quraysh for a 10-year hudna, a 10-year truce. This treaty lasted less than 2 years before it was violated by Quraysh allies, giving Muhammad, which became militarily stronger, the opportunity to conquer Mecca without a fight. And indeed, Islamist movements like Hamas frequently use and invoke the concept of hudna to justify temporary ceasefires with Israel. To complicate things even further, Muslim jurists have also relied on the Treaty of Hudaybiyah to justify permanent peace agreements with Israel, included in the cases of Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. So now let's go back to Syria. After Ashara became president, and we heard it also from Ro'i in the previous panel, one of his earliest steps was to reform the state religious establishment, and in March 2025, he re-established the Supreme Council of Fatwa, which was dissolved by President Assad in 2021. And he made it again the central religious authority of the new Syria. Shara appointed Sheikh Usama al-Rifai, we also heard his name before, as the new Grand Mufti and the head of this body to issue a religious edict and unify the religious discourse and rebuild a state-backed Islamic legitimacy as part of his broader state-building efforts. In April this year, the Supreme Fatwa of Council held its first meeting. This was the first session, you can see it here. It was chaired by al-Rifai and it took place at the International Library in Damascus. At the same time, the Syrian Islamic Council, which was an opposition-aligned religious authority operating from exile from Turkey, was formally dissolved at the request of the new government, clearing the way for a single state-controlled authority loyal to the new regime. So, who is the new appointed Grand Mufti? I already said his name, Osama al-Rifai. He was born in 1944 in Damascus. In the 70s, he became involved in Muslim Brotherhood activism, which brought him under regime pressure and eventually pushed him in in 1981 into exile outside of Syria. He returned to Syria in the mid-2000s during a brief period of political relative openness, and he re-established his influence in Damascus. And during the Arab Spring, El-Rifai supported the uprising, and he was attacked by the Syrian security forces, and he left in 2012 to Turkey, where he developed close ties with President Erdogan and was appointed as the opposition de facto mufti. In 2020, Rifai was among those who signed a fatwa issued by the Qatar-based International Union of Muslim Scholars, declaring that Islam forbids and outlaw any peace and normalization agreements with Israel. It was in the context of the Abraham Accords. In 2022, when Hamas leader visited Turkey, he met him, and he stressed his rejection during the meeting both to the Iranian exit and to normalization with Israel. As the new Grand Mufti of Syria, in the last year, he had at least two statements that reflect his general approach to Israel. In late March 2025, Israeli forces carried out a military operation in Daraa province in southern Syria, which killed 6 people and injured several others. In April, El-Rifai visited the families of the victims and offered his condolences, and he said during the meeting, you can see it here, these martyrs were killed by the worst of Allah's enemies, the most hostile and the meanest. And this was one of his first statements as the new Grand Mufti of Syria. He entered to office in March. 3 months later, in July, El-Rifai's Supreme Council of Fatwa issued another statement which was an official fatwa, and it was released in the context of the Israeli intervention to protect the Druze in Suwaida, following clashes between local Druze militias and the regime-backed Bedouin fighters that left hundreds of casualties. And the fatwa said, and I quote, that it is among the self-evident axioms that treason and seeking the help of the treacherous occupying Zionist enemy against one's own state is forbidden. This enemy proves time and again that it is suited only for hostility, not for treaties and agreements. As you can see, such a rhetoric echoes very much the Islamist discourse that I mentioned before, that portrays Jews as possessing inherent traits that prevent them from being possible partners for peace agreements. Other pro-regime religious figures also use similar rhetoric, describing Jews as enemies of Allah and fighting them. For example, Sheikh, his name is Ustad Muhammad Ma'ani. He is a Syrian Sheikh preaching at El Nur Mosque in New Aleppo. And this guy also has a Facebook page and YouTube channel with thousands and even 10,000s of followers. And he preached in a sermon in March 2025 that, and I quote again, killing is considered legitimate from an Islamic point of view when jihad is waged for the sake of Allah against the enemies of Allah, as is the case today with respect to the Jews. Against the Jews, jihad that obligates fighting them is absolutely applied. There is no disagreement on this among the religious scholars. It is agreed that Jews are murderers, sinners, and infidels who attack Muslims and seize their lands, their lives, their property, and so on. Fighting them is indisputable obligation. Yet he distinguished in his sermon between jihad as fard ain, an individual duty, and fard kifaya, a collective duty, saying that only if Jews reach Syrian lands, jihad becomes fard ain on every Syrian, urging Syrian people for preparation and weapon training in case it will happen. So, as you can see, it is quite hard to imagine how such an Islamist discourse could produce religious legitimacy for peace agreement between Syria and Israel. But as noted by Professor Zisser and by also by Roy and others today, we are not talking about agreement resembling the Abraham Accords or agreement like the peace treaty that we have with Egypt and Jordan, but rather we speak about a military arrangement, something like a return to the 1974 disengagement agreement. And the question is, can such an agreement, which is less than a peace treaty, may receive Islamic legal approval? And the answer, and my answer is yes. A military arrangement is totally different from a permanent peace agreement in the eyes of Islamists, and is closer to what was mentioned before as Hudna. In theory, just as Hamas has at times supported Hudna with Israel and suspended jihad for a limited period of time, in theory also the Ashara regime could also view Hudna as a pragmatic choice. Such a choice may reflect an awareness of the current balance of power between both sides, and it may allow the regime to focus on rebuilding Syria and consolidating its rule without abandoning its ideology or recognizing Israel as a permanent reality. And indeed, over the last year, supporters of the new Syrian regime have referred to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah as a precedent for an agreement with Israel. However, they have not fully clarified whether they mean only a Hudna or a permanent peace agreement. And the ambiguity may be deliberate, giving each audience room to draw its own conclusions. For example, this guy you see here, his name is Ma'amun Hama, or Abu Wa'el. He is a supporter of Ashara regime who runs a Facebook page with over 200,000 followers. And he published several videos that became viral with millions of views over the past years, invoking the Treaty of Hudaybiyah as a precedent for peace with Israel and the Jews. In one of the videos published early in 2025, he explained that Israel is not a primary enemy of the Syrian people. Rather, it is the Assad regime, Iran and their militias, and Israel did not fight the opposition forces in Syria during the Assad rule, but rather remained neutral. And he called on the Syrian people not to act emotionally, as Hamas did in October 7, but to use reason and wisdom regarding to Israel. And he mentioned that Prophet Muhammad favored the Treaty of Hudaybiyah because it allowed people to enter Islam without war, adding that, and I quote, "We are going to make with them, with Israel, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. We currently in a state of peace until Allah, the Almighty and Glorious, grants us a way out or a victory without a battle, God willing." And the comparison of a future agreement with Israel to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah sparked an Islamic debate in Syria and beyond. You can see here several posts that I took from the social media. When some responsive or some activists or even some religious clerics rejected the analogy, seeing possible agreement between Syria and Israel as abandoning the Palestinian and offering no clear benefits for the Muslims or for the Muslim nation, but others supported the analogy to the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, viewing a negotiating agreement with Israel as a pragmatic way to prevent bloodshed, destruction, and harm in Syria when no better realistic alternative is currently available. So to conclude, what Islamic discourses may tell us about the potential for Syrian-Israeli peace treaty. So first, the current Islamic discourse in Syria does not preach, for now at least, for peace agreement with Israel. Maybe the current discourse may challenge any prize by Ashara and his regime to promote such a peace. Secondly, we can learn from this discourse that an Islamist regime that rejects peace with Israel can still support a Hudna-style disengagement agreement based on the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. This raises the question of whether Israel should accept a Hudna with an Islamist regime, and this is a good question. I don't have a clear answer. On the one hand, returning to an arrangement like we had in following Yom Kippur War, like the disengagement agreement of 1974, offers advantages. It is easier for both sides to legitimize such an agreement. It requires no any painful concessions regarding the Golan Heights, and it may help building trust for a wider, hopefully wider agreement when conditions allow it in the future. On the other hand, such an agreement has flaws. It sets a precedent that deals with Israel can be reached without recognition and without normalization. It may allow an Islamist regime to entrench itself along Israel's border, and we had a bad experience with other Islamists in our borders in the south, and it could represent a missed historic opportunity maybe to reach to a more substantial agreement with Syria, given the new regime's current weakness and its incentive to gain political and economic benefits. And here is my closing note. Israel doesn't have to choose between peace and Hudna. A third option is also available, which is a military agreement with a symbolic political horizon. That includes, for example, a mutual commitment from both sides for avoiding the use of force, or for reaching, or a mutual commitment for reaching a permanent peace agreement in the future. This kind of approach combines short-term stabilization with the possibility of a gradual political process in the future. Such a formula could also test Ashara's long-term strategic intentions towards Israel, which we saw that are not so clear, and maybe it will tell us more whether he has truly moved away from his Islamist radical ideology. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Winter. Your analysis of the religious and ideological dimensions definitely adds an essential layer to our understanding. We have a few moments for questions. If anyone would like to pose a question to Dr. Winter.
I don't have, I think that the Druze themselves are separated on this question. There are at least two factions among them, and sometimes we heard during the last months and weeks that there are also fightings between the Druze people in Syria about their future. Maybe some of them wants to go back to the old alliance with the regime in Damascus, and others see a current opportunity to maybe to have autonomous status in southern Syria, and maybe have some Israeli protection. And of course, this is also, I think, it's an important Israeli consideration given the special relations between Israel and the Druze in Israel. Well, this is a good question. I'm not sure that I have a good answer, but maybe there is now, we are in a transition phase. So I think that many actors regionally and also internationally try to influence the regime and take it to their own side, and to maybe guarantee that he will have it will take the right decisions. Probably also the United States don't want, and also I think that some moderate Arab countries which are fully aware of the history of Ahmed Ashara and the ideology, the Islamist ideology, the Brotherhood ideology that guides him, still try to engage with him in order not to make him an ally of radical forces regionally and internationally. So maybe this is a good explanation, and maybe the Americans are not fully aware of his background. So so this is a question. Maybe they give him a chance to change and to have the right choices, or stay suspicious, or and it's a very complicated maneuvering that is going on. You know that most of the Syrians are Sunni, and of course this Shara and his followers, they dismissed pro-Shia Alawite regime. So they have no good relations with Iran, even though they are both Islamists in their own way. They are, I think this is they have, of course, big differences between the Shias and the Sunni in Syria, and I think when they try to bring, antithesis to the previous regime, they will probably stay away from Iran. So this is also maybe an opportunity from an Israeli point of view to make Syria less pro-Iranian actor and part of the resistant camp as it was during the Assad regime.
Thank you again, Dr. Winter. As we close today's conference, I want to thank all our speakers for their valuable contributions. The question, where is Syria headed, remains open, as it must in such uncertain times. But today's discussions have provided us with frameworks for understanding the forces shaping Syria's future. I'd like to extend special thanks to Dr. Yonker once again and congratulate him again on the Arabic translation of his important work. And I'd like to thank the Irwin Cotler Institute for Democracy, Justice and Human Rights, the Diplomats Club and Tel Aviv University for hosting this event. Thank you all for your attendance and engagement, and we look forward to welcoming you to our next event on January 18th, which will tackle the question of the United States in the age of disorder. We'll be looking at the future of American democracy, American Jewry, and America in the Middle East. Thank you once again. Hag Hanukkah Sameach and Merry Christmas.